Sometimes the hardest thing in life isn't losing everything. It's finding the courage to start over when you thought your time for new beginnings had passed. In 1887, two sisters named Lavinia and Ruth discovered this truth when they lost their family home and found themselves with nowhere to turn. They were 52 and 48 years old, standing at the gates of a stranger's ranch with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Their own brothers had turned them out after their father died, claiming unmarried women had no right to inherit anything. So they walked 300 miles to Clayton Rusk's cattle ranch, the wealthiest spread in the territory. When they offered to work without pay just for a place to sleep, something in their dignity reminded Clayton of the daughters he'd lost years before. He gave them the barn loft and a chance at a new life. But what were they hiding in that old leather satchel they carried? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across High Hollow Ranch as Clayton Rusk stood on his porch, coffee steaming in the cool mountain air. At 57, he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had built something lasting from nothing but determination and sweat. His silver-streaked beard caught the light as he surveyed the sprawling valley that had been his domain for nearly 3 decades. The ranch stretched as far as the eye could see, 15,000 acres of prime grazing land nestled between the Absaroka Mountains and the Yellowstone River. Cattle dotted the grasslands like scattered coins, their lowing carried on the morning breeze. The main house, built from local timber and stone, stood solid and welcoming despite its emptiness. Clayton had designed it for a family, with wide porches and large windows that let in the Montana sky. Now it echoed with memories instead of laughter. Behind him, through the kitchen window, he could see the 2 women who had appeared at his gates 3 nights ago. The older one, Lavinia, moved with careful precision as she organized his chaotic pantry. Her sister Ruth stood at the stove, her movements gentle and sure as she prepared what smelled like the best breakfast he'd had in years. There was something about them that nagged at his consciousness, a refinement in their bearing that seemed at odds with their worn clothing and desperate circumstances. Clayton's foreman, Miguel Valdez, approached from the barn, his weathered face creased with the kind of concern that came from 20 years of friendship. "Patron," he said in his accented English, "the signoras, they work very hard, but I wonder, do we know anything about them, where they come from?" "Does it matter, Miguel?" Clayton asked, though the same questions had been troubling his own thoughts. "They needed help. We had space." Miguel nodded slowly. "See, but be careful, my friend. Sometimes people run from things that follow them." The warning hung in the air as Clayton watched Ruth hang fresh curtains in the kitchen window. For the first time in 5 years, his house looked like a home again. Clayton's memory drifted to the damaged daguerreotype that sat on his dresser, only surviving portrait of his wife Sarah and their twin daughters, Emma and Grace. The glass had cracked during the terrible winter of 1882, the same winter that had taken all 3 of them to pneumonia. He'd been away on business in Billings, finalizing a cattle contract that would secure their future. By the time he returned, it was too late for goodbyes. The portrait showed Sarah's gentle smile, her arms around 2 gap-toothed girls who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. They would have been 12 now, growing into young women with their mother's kind eyes and perhaps their father's stubborn streak. Clayton had tried to imagine them aging, but grief had frozen them in time, eternal children in his wounded heart. Since their deaths, the ranch had become his monastery. He threw himself into the work, expanding the operation until High Hollow was the largest and most prosperous spread in 3 counties. Money had never been his goal, it was simply the byproduct of a man trying to outrun his sorrow. He employed 37 men during peak season, built a reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle, and donated generously to the church and school. But he'd never again opened his heart to the possibility of family. Until now, watching these 2 women bring life back to his empty house. Doc Patterson arrived just after noon, his black medical bag bouncing against his horse's flank. James Patterson had been Clayton's closest friend since the early days, when they'd both been young men chasing dreams in an untamed territory. Now in his 60s, the doctor served the scattered population of ranchers, miners, and townsfolk with equal dedication. "Heard you have house guests," Doc said, dismounting with the careful movements of a man whose joints reminded him daily of his age. "Thought I'd stop by and make sure they're settling in well." Clayton helped him with his horse. "They're good women, Doc, hard workers." "That's not what I'm concerned about," Doc replied, his grey eyes serious. "Word travels fast in small communities. People are curious about strangers, especially women traveling alone. Some folks are starting to whisper." They walked toward the house, where the aroma of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen. Through the window, they could see Lavinia bent over a ledger, her pen moving with quick efficiency as she worked through Clayton's neglected bookkeeping. "She has an educated hand," Doc observed, "not the writing of a common laborer." "I noticed that too," Clayton admitted. "Ruth mentioned they'd kept house for a wealthy family back east before." He paused, realizing how little he actually knew about their past. "Before what?" "Before circumstances changed." Doc gave him a knowing look. "Clayton, my friend, in 30 years of doctoring, I've learned that when people are that vague about their past, there's usually a good reason. The question is whether it's a reason that protects them or endangers them." That evening, as the sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, the three of them sat on the porch after the finest meal Clayton had enjoyed in years. Ruth had prepared roasted chicken with herbs from Sarah's abandoned garden, vegetables that somehow tasted better than anything his previous cooks had managed, and bread that melted on the tongue. "Mr. Rusk," Lavinia said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone educated beyond her current circumstances, "I've been reviewing your books. You have a remarkable operation here, but your record-keeping could use some attention." Clayton smiled. "Sarah used to handle all that. Since she's been gone, I've made a mess of things. If you'd permit me, I'd be happy to organize your accounts properly. I have experience with business ledgers." "What kind of business?" Clayton asked gently. The sisters exchanged a glance that didn't go unnoticed. "Various enterprises," Lavinia said carefully. "Our father taught us that a woman should understand numbers, regardless of her station." Ruth spoke for the first time since dinner. "Mr. Rusk, you've been so kind to us. We don't wish to impose longer than necessary." "Where would you go?" Clayton found himself asking, and was surprised by the concern in his own voice. "We're not entirely sure," Ruth admitted. "We had hoped to find work in one of the larger towns, perhaps as seamstresses or—" "Stay," Clayton said quietly, "for as long as you need. The house is too big for one man anyway." That night, Clayton stood at his bedroom window, watching the light in the barn loft where he'd given the sisters quarters. For the first time since Sarah's death, the ranch felt alive again. There was something about Lavinia's quiet strength and Ruth's gentle nature that reminded him not just of his lost daughters, but of the possibility that healing could come in unexpected forms. In the loft, Lavinia carefully placed their worn leather satchel beneath her bed. Inside, wrapped in faded silk, lay documents that could change everything if anyone ever discovered them. She looked at her sleeping sister and whispered a prayer that they had finally found a place where their past couldn't follow. The satchel held more than papier-sit, contained the evidence of who they really were and why their brothers would never stop hunting them. But for tonight, in this place of unexpected kindness, Lavinia allowed herself to hope that perhaps they could build something new from the ashes of what they'd lost. Outside, a coyote called to the moon, and the wind carried the scent of sage and possibility across the Montana plains. The stranger arrived on a Tuesday morning when the autumn air carried the first promise of winter. Clayton noticed him from the corral, where he was working with a young Coulter man in a dark suit, riding a rented horse, clearly uncomfortable in the saddle. Everything about him screamed city dweller, from his polished boots to the way he squinted against the Montana sun. "Morning," the man called out, dismounting awkwardly. "Name's Herbert Whitman. I'm looking for information about 2 women who might have passed through this area." Clayton's hand stilled on the colt's halter. From the corner of his eye, he could see Lavinia hanging laundry near the house. She had gone rigid at the sound of the stranger's voice. "Lot of people pass through," Clayton said carefully. "What's your interest in these particular women?" Whitman pulled out a folded paper from his jacket. "Sisters, middle-aged. They may be traveling under false names. There's a substantial reward for information leading to their whereabouts." "Reward?" Clayton stepped closer, his tone deceptively casual. "What did they do?" "Theft," Whitman said without hesitation. "They disappeared with valuable family documents and a considerable sum of money. Their own brothers hired me to find them." Clayton's jaw tightened. In his peripheral vision, he saw Ruth appear in the kitchen doorway, her face pale as moonlight. "These brothers have names?" "Blackwood, prominent family from Boston. The women would be Lavinia and Ruth Blackwood, though they might be using different surnames now." Whitman's eyes scanned the ranch buildings. "Mind if I look around? Ask your workers if they've seen anything." "I do mind," Clayton said firmly. "This is private property, and I don't take kindly to strangers making accusations about theft without proof." Whitman's expression hardened. "I have legal authority to—" "Not in Montana territory, you don't." Clayton's voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You want to search my property, you get a warrant from the territorial judge. Until then, I'll thank you to move along." The detective studied Clayton's face for a long moment, then mounted his horse with the same awkward movements. "I'll be in town for a few days, asking questions. If you remember anything useful, there's $50 in it for you." Clayton watched him ride away before walking quickly to the house. He found both sisters in the kitchen, Lavinia gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had gone white. "We have to leave," Ruth whispered, "right now before he comes back with—" "No," Clayton's voice was firm. "You're not going anywhere until I understand what's really happening here." Lavinia looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mr. Rusk, you've been kind to us, but you don't understand what you're getting involved in. Our brothers, they're not good men." "Then tell me the truth." Clayton pulled out a chair and sat across from them. "All of it." The sisters exchanged another of their wordless communications. Finally, Lavinia reached beneath her apron and withdrew a folded paper, the same legal notice that Clayton had intercepted from the town's bulletin board that morning. "You already knew," she said, reading his expression. Clayton nodded. "I saw this posted outside Henderson's store, took it down before anyone else could read it." He unfolded the paper and read aloud. "Seeking information regarding the whereabouts of Lavinia Marie Blackwood, age 52, and Ruth Elizabeth Blackwood, age 48, missing from Boston since August 15th, 1887. Substantial reward offered. Contact Whitman Detective Agency." "We're not missing," Ruth said quietly. "We ran." "From theft charges?" "From our brother's greed," Lavinia said, her voice gaining strength. "When our father died 6 months ago, he left a will that divided his estate equally among all his children. Charles and William Orr brothers couldn't accept that unmarried women would inherit the same as they did." Ruth continued the story. "They produced a second will, claiming father had changed his mind before he died. This new document left everything to them. With small annuities for use if we agreed to live under their guardianship for the rest of our lives." "Like children," Lavinia added bitterly. "Or prisoners." Clayton leaned back in his chair. "So you took what you believed was rightfully yours and left." "We took nothing but our personal belongings and some family papers that belonged to our mother," Ruth said. "But Charles and William reported us to the police as thieves. They claimed we stole money and documents." "What kind of documents?" Lavinia hesitated, then rose and disappeared into their room. She returned with the worn leather satchel they'd carried when they first arrived. From it, she withdrew a bundle wrapped in faded silk. "Our mother's jewelry, some letters father wrote to her during their courtship, and—" She paused, unwrapping a folded document with careful hands. "The original deed to father's property, showing how he acquired the land that became the foundation of his fortune." Clayton examined the deed, noting the official seals and signatures. This looks legitimate. It is, but our brothers claim we forged it. Lavinia's voice carried years of accumulated pain. They've convinced half of Boston society that we're mad spinsters who've stolen family heirlooms out of spite. Are there other witnesses, people who knew your father's true wishes? Father's lawyer died 2 months before father did, Ruth said. Very convenient timing for our brothers. The new lawyer they hired had never met father personally. Clayton was quiet for a long moment, processing what he'd learned. Why Montana? Why here specifically? We heard about the territory from our father's friend, a man named James Patterson who... Doc Patterson? Clayton interrupted. You know Doc? Lavinia nodded. He corresponded with our father for years. They served together in the war. When we needed somewhere to go, we remembered his letters mentioning this valley. Doc never said he knew you. We asked him not to, Ruth explained. We weren't sure who we could trust. But when we heard about your ranch, about you being a fair man who'd lost his family, we thought perhaps you might understand what it meant to lose everything. Clayton stood and walked to the window, watching Miguel directing the afternoon work. This detective, he'll be back, and he won't be alone next time. We know, Lavinia said quietly. That's why we have to leave before. No. Clayton turned back to them, his decision made. You're not running anymore. If you're telling the truth about this inheritance, then you have legal rights that need protecting. Mr. Rusk, you don't understand, Ruth protested. Charles and William have money, connections, lawyers. They've already convinced the Boston police that we're criminals. This isn't Boston, Clayton said firmly. This is Montana territory, and I know the territorial judge personally. If you're willing to fight for what's rightfully yours, I'll help you do it. Lavinia stared at him in amazement. Why would you risk your reputation, your business, for 2 women you barely know? Clayton thought of Sarah and his daughters, of the family he'd lost and the empty years that had followed. Because sometimes doing the right thing is more important than playing it safe. And because, he paused, surprised by his own honesty, because this ranch has been too quiet for too long. That afternoon, Clayton rode to town and found Doc Patterson at his clinic. The older man looked up from bandaging a miner's injured hand when Clayton walked in. James, we need to talk. Doc finished his work and led Clayton to his private office. This is about the Blackwood sisters, isn't it? You knew who they were from the beginning. I suspected. Their father, Jonathan Blackwood, wrote to me about his daughters several times over the years. He was worried about what would happen to them after he was gone. Doc poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a bottle he kept for difficult conversations. Jonathan was a good man, but he made the mistake of trusting his sons to do right by their sisters. So you believe their story? Every word. Jonathan sent me a letter just before he died, expressing his fears about Charles and William. He suspected they were already making plans to contest his will. Clayton accepted the whiskey gratefully. There's a detective in town asking questions, claims the sisters are thieves. Herbert Whitman. He's been making rounds, offering money for information. Most folks are too polite to tell him anything, but it's only a matter of time before someone talks. What do you think we should do? Doc was quiet for a moment, studying the amber liquid in his glass. I think those women have suffered enough. And I think a certain rancher I know has been alone too long to pass up a chance at redemption, both theirs and his own. That evening, Clayton gathered the sisters in his study and laid out a plan. Tomorrow, I'm riding to the territorial capital to speak with Judge Morrison. I'll explain the situation and see about getting you legal representation. The expenses, Lavinia began. Are mine to worry about, Clayton cut her off. But I need to know. Is there anything else you haven't told me? Any other secrets that might surface? The sisters looked at each other, and Clayton caught another of those wordless exchanges. There is one more thing, Lavinia said finally. She reached into the satchel again and withdrew another document. This is a letter Father wrote shortly before he died, addressed to Dr. Patterson. He never had a chance to send it. Clayton read the letter with growing amazement. In it, Jonathan Blackwood detailed his suspicions about his sons and his fears for his daughters. More importantly, he revealed the existence of a second villain that left everything to Lavinia and Ruth, disinheriting Charles and William entirely after he discovered they had been stealing from his business accounts. "He hid this will?" Clayton asked. "Somewhere safe, according to the letter. But he died before he could tell us where." Clayton folded the letter carefully. "Then we'll find it. And when we do, your brothers are going to discover what happens when they threaten people under my protection." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the scent of approaching weather. For the first time since their arrival, the sisters allowed themselves to hope that perhaps their long flight was finally over. But in town, Herbert Whitman was composing a telegram to his employers in Boston, informing them that he'd found their quarry. By morning, Charles and William Blackwood would know exactly where their sisters had taken refuge. The storm that was coming would be about more than just weather. The discovery came by accident, as the most meaningful discoveries often do. Ruth had been cleaning the kitchen thoroughly, determined to earn her keep through meticulous care of Clayton's home. When she moved the heavy wooden cabinet that held his few dishes, she found a small, leather-bound book that had fallen behind it years ago. The cover was worn smooth by loving hands, and the pages yellowed with age. Inside, in careful script, were dozens of recipes written in a woman's delicate handwriting. Sarah's kitchen treasures was inscribed on the first page, followed by, "For my beloved husband and precious daughters, may these bring warmth to your hearts and home." Ruth sat on the kitchen floor, surrounded by dust and forgotten memories, tears streaming down her face as she read through Sarah Rusk's final gift to her family. There were recipes for Christmas cookies shaped like stars, instructions for the perfect Sunday roast, and notes about which herbs grew best in the Montana soil. Scattered throughout were little messages, reminders to Clayton to eat properly when she wasn't there to fuss over him, suggestions for special meals to celebrate the girls' birthdays, dreams of future family gatherings written in fading ink. When Clayton returned from the barn that afternoon, he found Ruth at the stove, the recipe book open beside her, as she stirred something that smelled like heaven itself. "Where did you find that?" he asked quietly, recognizing the book immediately. "Behind the cabinet. I hope you don't mind, I wanted to try her corn chowder recipe." Ruth's voice was soft with understanding. "She must have been a wonderful cook." Clayton picked up the book, his fingers tracing the familiar handwriting. "She used to say that food was love made visible. Every meal was a way of taking care of us." "Would you like me to put it away?" Ruth asked, sensing his pain. "No." Clayton closed the book gently and handed it back to her. "Sarah would have wanted it to be used. She always said recipes were meant to be shared, not stored away gathering dust." That evening, the three of them sat down to a meal that would have made Sarah Rusk proud. Ruth had followed the corn chowder recipe exactly, and the result was a rich, comforting soup that seemed to warm more than just their bodies. For dessert, she had attempted Sarah's apple cobbler, using fruit from the neglected orchard behind the house. "This tastes exactly like Sarah used to make," Clayton said, his voice thick with emotion. "How did you?" "She wrote very detailed instructions," Ruth replied. "She obviously wanted to make sure anyone could recreate her dishes perfectly." As the days passed, Ruth threw herself into mastering Sarah's recipes with the dedication of a woman who understood that food could heal wounds that words couldn't touch. Each meal became an act of service, a way of honoring both the dead and the living. Clayton began to look forward to dinner again, not just for the excellent food, but for the sense of family that had been missing from his life for so long. Meanwhile, Lavinia had taken over Clayton's chaotic business records with the efficiency of a woman who had clearly done such work before. She spread the ledgers across the dining room table and spent hours unraveling years of neglected bookkeeping. "Mr. Rusk," she said one morning, looking up from a pile of receipts and invoices, "when was the last time you reviewed your accounts?" Clayton paused in the doorway, coffee cup in hand. "I pay the bills when they come due and deposit money when I sell cattle." Seemed simple enough. Simple perhaps, but not wise. Lavinia held up a thick sheaf of papers. "You're missing out on significant savings by not tracking your expenses properly." And there are several vendors who appear to be overcharging you consistently. She had organized everything with mathematical precision: income in one column, expenses in another, with careful notations about patterns and discrepancies. Her handwriting was elegant and sure, the work of someone educated in business practices. "You have a keen eye for numbers," Clayton observed. "Where did you learn bookkeeping?" "Our father insisted his daughters understand finance as well as his sons did," Lavinia replied. "He said a woman who couldn't manage money would always be at the mercy of those who could." Wise man. He was, in most ways. Her voice carried a note of sadness that made Clayton want to know more about the man who had raised such remarkable daughters, yet somehow failed to protect them from their brother's greed. As the week progressed, Lavinia's presence began to transform not just Clayton's business records, but his understanding of his own operation. She identified inefficiencies he'd never noticed, suggested improvements that could save both time and money, and organized his affairs with a competence that impressed him more each day. "You're running a substantial enterprise here," she told him one evening as they reviewed the monthly totals. "But you're thinking like a rancher, not a businessman. What's the difference?" "A rancher works with his hands and his heart. A businessman works with his mind and his strategy." She smiled to soften any sting in her words. "You need both approaches to truly succeed." It was during these evening sessions over the ledgers that Clayton began to see Lavinia as more than just a refugee from family troubles. She was intelligent, capable, and possessed of a quick wit that emerged when she felt safe enough to let down her guard. Their conversations ranged from cattle prices to territorial politics, and Clayton found himself looking forward to their discussions almost as much as he enjoyed Ruth's cooking. The transformation wasn't lost on Miguel, who watched the changes in his employer with the keen eyes of a longtime friend. "Patron," he said one morning as they checked fences in the south pasture, "you seem, how do I say, more alive these days." Clayton adjusted his hat against the autumn sun. "The sisters are good workers. They've made the house more efficient." Miguel chuckled. "See, the house is more efficient, but I think perhaps the man who lives in the house is more efficient too, no?" Before Clayton could respond, they spotted a rider approaching from the direction of town. As the figure drew closer, they recognized Thomas Brennan, who owned the neighboring Circle B ranch. Thomas was a good man in his early 50s, a widower whose own wife had died in childbirth 3 years earlier. "Clayton," Thomas called out as he rode up. "Heard you have some lady guests staying at your place." "News travels fast," Clayton replied neutrally. "Small community. People talk." Thomas dismounted and walked his horse alongside theirs. "I was wondering, would it be appropriate for me to pay a social call? Been a long time since we've had cultured ladies in the territory." Clayton felt an unexpected twinge of something that might have been jealousy. "They're still settling in, Thomas. Might be best to give them more time." Of course. I wouldn't want to intrude." Thomas paused, then added, "But perhaps when they're ready for visitors, you might mention that I'd be honored to make their acquaintance. Especially the older sister, Lavinia, I think her name is." "I'll mention it," Clayton said, though something in his chest tightened at the thought of Thomas Brennan courting Lavinia. That evening, Clayton found himself studying Lavinia with new eyes as she worked on his accounts. She was an attractive woman, he realized, not in the flashy way of youth, but with the deeper beauty that came from character and intelligence. Her auburn hair, streaked with silver, caught the lamplight as she bent over the ledgers. Her hands, though work-worn, moved with graceful precision. "Mr. Rusk," Lavinia's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Is something wrong? You seem distracted." "Thomas Brennan stopped by today," Clayton said. "He'd like to call on you when you're ready for visitors." Something flickered across Lavinia's face, a surprise, perhaps, or uncertainty. "That's very kind of him, but I'm hardly in a position to receive social callers. Thomas is a good man, honorable. He owns the ranch bordering our northern boundary. I'm sure he's quite respectable," Lavinia said carefully, "but given our circumstances, the detective, our brother-sit, might be unwise to form new attachments right now." Clayton nodded, telling himself he was relieved by her practical response. But as he watched her return to the ledgers, he couldn't shake the feeling that his motivation for discouraging Thomas Brennan's interest had more to do with his own growing feelings than with Lavinia's safety. The next morning brought unexpected news. Doc Patterson arrived with his medical bag and a telegram that had been delivered to his office. "This came for you yesterday," he told Clayton, handing over the yellow paper. "Figured it might be important." Clayton read the message twice, then looked up at his friend with grim satisfaction. "Judge Morrison will see us next Tuesday. He's agreed to review the sisters' case personally." "That's good news," Doc said. "Morrison's a fair man. If their claim is legitimate, he'll make sure they get proper legal representation." "There's more," Clayton continued. "I sent inquiries to some business contacts in Denver and Cheyenne. If the Blackwood estate is as substantial as the sisters claim, there should be records of property transfers, bank transactions, that sort of thing." Doc raised an eyebrow. "You're taking this investigation seriously." "I don't like seeing good people taken advantage of," Clayton replied, but even as he said it, he knew there was more to his motivation than simple justice. The thought of Lavinia and Ruth being forced to return to Boston, to lives of dependency under their brother's control, was becoming increasingly unacceptable to him. That afternoon, while Clayton was in town gathering supplies for the coming winter, Ruth made a discovery that would change everything. She had been organizing Sarah's recipe book more carefully, intending to create a proper index, when she noticed that some of the pages seemed thicker than others. Examining them more closely in the good light by the kitchen window, she realized that several pages had additional papers pasted behind them, hidden so skillfully that they appeared to be part of the original book. With trembling fingers, she carefully separated one of the concealed documents. It was a letter, written in her father's familiar handwriting, addressed to "My dearest daughters," and dated just 2 weeks before his death. Ruth's heart pounded as she read the first few lines. Then she called urgently for her sister. When Lavinia saw what Ruth had found, she sank into a chair as if her legs could no longer support her. "He knew," Lavinia whispered. "Somehow, Father knew we would end up here. He must have sent this to Sarah, asking her to hide it where we would eventually find it." The letter revealed Jonathan Blackwood's growing suspicions about his son's business practices and his decision to protect his daughters by creating a new will that would leave them his entire estate. More importantly, it contained detailed instructions about where he had hidden the original documents, not in Boston, but in a safety deposit box in Denver, under an assumed name. "He was protecting us even after death," Ruth said, tears streaming down her face. When Clayton returned and learned about the discovery, he felt a surge of hope that surprised him with its intensity. "This changes everything," he said. "With these instructions, we can locate the real will and prove your brother's fraud." "But what if it's too late?" Lavinia asked. "What if Charles and William have already destroyed the evidence?" "Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Clayton replied firmly. "But I have a feeling your father was too smart to let his sons outsmart him that easily." As the sun set over High Hollow Ranch that evening, the three of them sat on the porch, sharing a quiet meal and an enormous sense of possibility. For the first time since leaving Boston, the sisters dared to hope that justice might prevail. But in town, Herbert Whitman was composing another telegram, this one summoning reinforcements. Charles and William Blackwood had decided that subtle investigation was taking too long. They were coming to Montana themselves, with enough legal documentation and hired muscle to reclaim their sisters, willing or not. The wedding ring had been on Clayton's finger for so long that he'd forgotten what his hand looked like without it. 23 years of marriage, followed by 5 years of widowhood, and still he twisted the simple gold band whenever he was thinking deeply. It had become as much a part of him as his weathered skin or his calloused palms. But on this particular evening, as he sat in his study watching Lavinia work on his accounts by lamplight, Clayton found himself staring at the ring with new awareness. Sarah had been gone for 5 years. His daughters would have been 17 now, probably married themselves or at least thinking about it. Life moved forward, whether a man was ready for it or not. Lavinia looked up from the ledger she was reviewing, catching him in his contemplation. "Is everything all right, Mr. Rusk?" "Clayton," he said quietly. "I think after everything we've been through, you can call me Clayton." She smiled, and he noticed how the expression transformed her entire face. "Very well, Clayton, but you seemed troubled about something." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the barn where he'd first given them shelter. "Lavinia, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." "Of course. Do you ever think about what happens after we resolve this legal matter with your brothers? Where you'll go, what you'll do?" Lavinia set down her pen carefully. "Ruth and I have discussed it. If we regain our inheritance, we'll have the means to start over somewhere. Perhaps California, or one of the larger cities where we could live independently. And if you don't regain it, then we'll find work somewhere, as we originally planned. We're not afraid of honest labor." Clayton turned back to face her. "There's a third option." "Which is?" "You could stay here, permanently." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Neither was quite ready to address directly. Lavinia's cheeks flushed slightly, but she met his gaze steadily. "Clayton, you've been more than kind to us, but we couldn't impose on your generosity indefinitely." "What if it wasn't generosity?" he asked quietly. "What if it was something else entirely?" Before Lavinia could respond, Ruth's voice called from the kitchen. "Lavinia, could you help me with something?" The moment was broken, but something had shifted between them. As Lavinia excused herself to help her sister, Clayton remained at the window, slowly working the wedding ring off his finger for the first time in 5 years. He walked to his bedroom and opened the small wooden box where he kept his most precious possessions, Sarah's last letter to him, a lock of each daughter's hair, and a few pieces of jewelry Sarah had worn. With reverent hands, he placed the wedding ring inside the box and closed the lid. "Thank you for the years we had," he whispered to the photograph on his dresser. "I think it's time to see what comes next." The next morning brought Thomas Brennan for an official visit, dressed in his finest suit and carrying a bouquet of late-season wildflowers. Ruth had seen him approaching and quickly tidied the parlor, while Lavinia checked her appearance in the mirror with an attention to detail that hadn't escaped Clayton's notice. "Mr. Brennan," Clayton said, greeting his neighbor at the door with mixed feelings. "Good to see you." "Clayton, I hope I'm not calling too early. I brought these for the ladies." Thomas held up the flowers with the slightly awkward air of a man out of practice with courtship. They gathered in the parlor, where Ruth served coffee and some of Sarah's cookies that she'd mastered from the recipe book. Thomas was at his most charming, regaling them with stories of territorial politics and the challenges of ranching in Montana's unpredictable climate. "Miss Lavinia," he said during a lull in the conversation, "I wondered if you might enjoy seeing some of our beautiful countryside. I'd be honored to escort you on a ride through the valley, perhaps show you the overlook where you can see 3 states on a clear day." Lavinia glanced at Clayton before responding. "That's very thoughtful, Mr. Brennan, but given our current circumstances, I'm not sure it would be appropriate for me to—" "Nonsense," Thomas interrupted gently. "You can't spend all your time worrying about legal matters. A pleasant ride might be just what you need to clear your head." Clayton found himself speaking before he'd consciously decided to. "Lavinia has been working very hard on my business accounts. She deserves some leisure time." Ruth gave her sister an encouraging smile. "It would be good for you to get out of the house for a while." And so it was decided. The following afternoon, Thomas returned with a gentle mare and a side saddle, and Clayton watched from his porch as Lavinia rode away with another man, for the first time since she'd arrived at High Hollow. They returned 3 hours later, Lavinia's cheeks flushed from the cool air, and her eyes bright with the kind of happiness Clayton hadn't seen in her before. Thomas helped her dismount, with obvious reluctance to end their time together. "Thank you for a lovely afternoon," Lavinia said as Thomas prepared to leave. "The views were spectacular." "Perhaps we could do it again soon," Thomas asked hopefully. "There are many beautiful spots I'd love to show you." After Thomas left, Clayton found himself inexplicably irritated. He threw himself into ranch work with unusual intensity, checking fences that didn't need checking and reorganizing the barn in ways that made Miguel shake his head in confusion. That evening at dinner, Ruth innocently asked about the ride. "It was wonderful," Lavinia said. "Mr. Brennan is very knowledgeable about the territory's history. Did you know there was once a Crow village in the valley just north of here?" "Thomas knows a lot about many things," Clayton said curtly, then immediately regretted his tone. Lavinia looked at him curiously. "You sound as though you disapprove of him." "Not at all. Thomas is a good man and a good neighbor. But—" Clayton set down his fork, struggling with feelings he wasn't entirely ready to examine. "But nothing. If you enjoyed his company, that's what matters." Later that evening, as they worked on the accounts together, Lavinia brought up the subject again. "Clayton, if my spending time with Mr. Brennan makes you uncomfortable, I can decline future invitations." "Why would it make me uncomfortable?" "I don't know. You seemed distant this afternoon." Clayton looked at her across the table, at the way the lamplight caught the silver threads in her hair, at the gentle intelligence in her eyes, and felt something break open in his chest. "Maybe because I've grown accustomed to having you here," he said quietly. "Maybe because the thought of you riding off with Thomas Brennan made me realize I don't want you to ride off with anyone." Lavinia's breath caught. "Clayton, I know it's too soon," he continued quickly. "I know you have legal battles to fight and decisions to make about your future. But I also know that for the first time in 5 years, I wake up looking forward to the day ahead. And it's because of you and Ruth, because you've brought life back to this place." "We've brought complications too," Lavinia said softly. "The best things in life usually do." They looked at each other across the table, the ledgers forgotten, both of them aware that they were standing at the edge of something that could change everything. "Ruth has been encouraging me to consider Mr. Brennan's suit," Lavinia said finally. "And what do you think about that?" "I think my sister wants to see me settled and secure. She worries about what will happen to us if we can't prove our case against our brothers." "That's not what I asked." Lavinia smiled. "No, it isn't." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "I think Thomas Brennan is a good man who deserves a woman who can love him completely. And I think I've discovered that my heart is otherwise engaged." Clayton turned his hand palm up, capturing her fingers in his. "Lavinia, I can't promise you an easy life. These legal troubles with your brothers, they're going to get worse before they get better. And I'm not a young man anymore. Neither am I a young woman. We're past the age of easy promises and fairy tale endings, but perhaps that makes what we might build together all the more precious." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of multiple horses approaching the ranch. Clayton released Lavinia's hand and went to the window, his expression darkening as he saw 4 riders silhouetted against the moonlight. "Stay here," he told the sisters, reaching for the rifle he kept mounted above the fireplace. But as the riders drew closer, Clayton recognized the lead figure. It was Sheriff Ben Morrison, the territorial judge's younger brother. Behind him rode Doc Patterson and 2 men. Clayton didn't recognize men in city clothes who looked like they'd ridden hard from a long distance. "Clayton Rusk," one of the strangers called out. "We have legal documents requiring the surrender of 2 fugitive women believed to be harbored on these premises." Clayton stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand but not yet raised. "Sheriff Morrison, what's this about?" Ben Morrison dismounted, his face grim. "Clayton, I'm sorry about this, but I have a warrant here signed by a federal judge in Denver. These gentlemen are Charles and William Blackwood, and they have legal guardianship papers for their sisters." From the doorway behind Clayton, he heard Lavinia's sharp intake of breath. When he turned, he saw both sisters standing there, their faces pale but resolute. "We're not going back with them," Lavinia said clearly. "Not willingly." Charles Blackwood, a heavy-set man with cold eyes and expensive clothes, stepped forward. "You don't have a choice, sister. You're both declared incompetent by reason of mental instability. These papers give us full legal authority to take you back to Boston for proper medical care." "Mental instability?" Ruth's voice shook with outrage. "We've done nothing but try to claim what our father left us." "After stealing family documents and money," William Blackwood added. He was thinner than his brother, but equally well-dressed and equally unsympathetic. "The courts have ruled in our favor. You're coming home." Clayton stepped between the brothers and the sisters. "Not tonight, they're not. It's late, and these ladies are under my protection." "Mr. Rusk," Charles said with obvious effort at politeness, "I appreciate your concern, but this is a family matter. We're prepared to compensate you for any expenses you've incurred in caring for our sisters." "They're not your property to reclaim," Clayton said flatly. Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Clayton, I have to enforce this warrant. But given the late hour, I suppose the ladies could remain here tonight under guard, with transfer to take place in the morning." "No guard will be necessary," Doc Patterson spoke up for the first time. "I'll vouch for the ladies' presence in the morning." Charles and William exchanged glances. They clearly weren't happy with the delay, but they also didn't want to create more of a scene than necessary. "Very well," Charles said finally. "But we'll be back at first light, and if our sisters aren't ready to travel peacefully, we'll use whatever force is necessary to ensure compliance." As the men remounted and rode toward town, Clayton felt the weight of how much had changed in just a few hours. The peace they'd found at High Hollow was about to be shattered, and the legal battle they'd been preparing for had arrived on their doorstep with the force of a Montana thunderstorm. Inside the house, Lavinia and Ruth sat at the kitchen table, holding hands and trying to process what had just happened. "They've thought of everything," Lavinia said numbly. "Mental incompetence. It's the perfect legal strategy. No one questions a man's right to control his mentally unstable sisters." "We have until morning," Clayton said grimly. "Doc Patterson will help us figure out our options." But even as he spoke, Clayton knew that their options were limited. The brothers had come prepared with federal warrants and legal guardianship papers. Unless they could prove the fraud behind the brothers' claims, Lavinia and Ruth would be forced to return to Boston as virtual prisoners. The war for the Blackwood inheritance was about to begin in earnest, and Clayton realized he was willing to fight it not just for justice, but for the family he'd unexpectedly found in two desperate women who'd appeared at his gates, asking only for shelter. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind carried the promise of a long, difficult night ahead. Dawn came too soon, and not soon enough. Clayton had spent the night alternating between pacing his study and standing guard on the porch, his rifle never far from reach. The sisters had retreated to their room in the barn loft, and he could see the soft glow of their lamp burning through the small window until nearly 3 in the morning. When the sun finally crested the mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, Clayton found Ruth in the kitchen making coffee with hands that trembled only slightly. Her face was composed, but he could see the fear she was trying so hard to hide. "Where's Lavinia?" he asked quietly. "Getting dressed. We decided," Ruth's voice caught, and she had to start again. "We decided we should look our best. Father always said that dignity was something no one could take from you unless you gave it away." Clayton accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how Ruth had managed to make it exactly the way he liked it despite everything that was happening. "Ruth, about yesterday, what I said to your sister about my feelings." "I'm glad you told her," Ruth interrupted gently. "Lavinia has been alone for so long, taking care of everyone else. She deserves to know that someone sees her worth. Even if I can't protect her from this." Ruth turned to face him fully, and Clayton was struck by the strength in her gentle features. "Mr. Russ Clayton, you've already given us more than protection. You've given us hope. And sometimes hope is more powerful than all the legal documents in the world." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching. Through the window, Clayton could see the Blackwood brothers returning with Sheriff Morrison, the detective Whitman, and 2 additional men who looked like hired muscle. Lavinia appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed in the best clothes she owned, dark blue dress that had seen better days but was clean and well mended. Her hair was arranged in a neat chignon, and she carried herself with the poise of a woman born to better circumstances than these. "Are you ready?" Clayton asked. "As ready as one can be for kidnapping sanctioned by law," Lavinia replied with a bitter smile. The 3 of them walked out to meet the approaching party. Charles Blackwood dismounted with the air of a man accustomed to getting his way, while his brother William remained on horseback, clearly expecting a quick resolution. "Ladies," Charles said with false warmth. "I trust you've reconsidered your position overnight. We have a train to catch in Billings this afternoon." "We haven't reconsidered anything," Lavinia said clearly. "We maintain that we are not mentally incompetent, that we are not thieves, and that we will not return to Boston under your guardianship." Sheriff Morrison looked uncomfortable as he pulled out the legal documents. "Ladies, I'm afraid the law is clear. These papers give your brothers full authority." "Sheriff!" Doc Patterson's voice interrupted as he rode up with Judge Morrison. "Before you execute that warrant, there are some things you need to see." Judge Morrison dismounted with the measured movements of a man who had learned that hasty decisions often led to unjust outcomes. He was a tall, lean man in his 60s, with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Blackwood," he addressed Charles, "I've reviewed the papers you filed with the Territorial Court, and I have some questions." "Your Honor," Charles replied smoothly, "I'm not sure what questions there could be. The federal warrant is quite clear." "The federal warrant is based on allegations of theft and mental incompetence," Judge Morrison interrupted. "But Dr. Patterson has brought to my attention some information that casts doubt on both claims." Doc Patterson dismounted and opened his medical bag, withdrawing a folder of documents. "Your Honor, I have here correspondence from Jonathan Blackwood dating back 15 years. In these letters, he repeatedly praised his daughter's intelligence, business acumen, and mental stability. He also expressed growing concern about his son's financial practices." William Blackwood finally spoke up, his voice sharp with anxiety. "Those letters prove nothing. Our father's judgment was clouded by sentiment." "Perhaps," Judge Morrison said mildly, "but I also have this." He held up the letter that Ruth had discovered, hidden in Sarah's recipe book. "This was written by your father just 2 weeks before his death, and it tells a very different story about his final wishes." Charles's face had gone pale, but he maintained his composure. "Your Honor, with respect, a single letter of questionable provenance hardly overturns legal documents properly executed and witnessed." "You're right," Judge Morrison agreed, "but it does raise enough questions to warrant a more thorough investigation before I allow you to remove these ladies from the territory." Clayton felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly dampened by Charles Blackwood's next words. "Your Honor, while I appreciate your caution, the federal warrant supersedes territorial jurisdiction. We're not requesting your permission, we're informing you of our intentions." Judge Morrison's expression hardened. "Mr. Blackwood, you may have federal paper, but you're standing on Montana soil. And in my territory, we believe in examining all the evidence before separating Family 7, when that separation is requested by family members themselves." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut when another rider approached from the direction of town. Clayton recognized the man as Pete Henderson, who ran the general store and served as the unofficial telegraph operator. "Judge Morrison," Henderson called out as he drew near, "got an urgent telegram for you from Denver." The judge read the telegram quickly, his eyebrows rising as he processed the information. "Well, this is interesting," he said finally. "It seems there's been a development in Colorado." "What kind of development?" Charles demanded. "The kind that involves a safety deposit box registered under the name J. Blackwood at the First National Bank of Denver. A box that was opened yesterday by court order and found to contain a will dated 3 days before your father's death, will that appears to disinherit you and your brother, completely in favor of your sisters." The silence that followed was so complete that Clayton could hear the wind moving through the autumn grass. Charles and William Blackwood looked like men who had just watched their world collapse. "That's impossible," William said finally. "Father never traveled to Denver. He was too ill in his final weeks to—" The will was delivered to the bank by his attorney. Judge Morrison continued reading from the telegram. "A Mr. Edward Thorne, who has provided a sworn affidavit that he was acting on your father's explicit instructions." "Thorne died," Charles said quickly. "He died before father." "No, he didn't," Doc Patterson interrupted. "Edward Thorne is very much alive and currently practicing law in Denver. The man who died was Edward Thurston, your father's more recent attorney." Different men entirely, though I can see how you might have confused themes specially if you were counting on Thurston's death to eliminate inconvenient witnesses. Clayton watched the brothers' faces as the web of their deception began to unravel. These were men who had built their scheme on careful lies and the assumption that no one would look too closely at their claims. Now, confronted with evidence they hadn't known existed, their practiced confidence was cracking. "This is preposterous," Charles blustered. "Even if such a will exists, it was obviously forged. Our father would never—" "Your father discovered you'd been embezzling from his business accounts," Judge Morrison said quietly, reading further from the telegram. "Mr. Thorne's affidavit details several meetings where your father expressed his outrage at your theft and his determination to protect his daughters from your greed." Lavinia had gone very still beside Clayton, her hand gripping his arm so tightly he could feel her nails through his shirt sleeve. Ruth was openly weeping, but whether from relief or overwhelming emotion, Clayton couldn't tell. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "the Denver authorities have discovered evidence that you've been using forged documents to access your father's bank accounts since his death. There are now warrants out for your arrest on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy." The hired muscle behind the brothers began to look decidedly uncomfortable, clearly having signed on for a simple escort job rather than a criminal enterprise. One of them quietly backed his horse away from the group. "Sheriff Morrison," Judge Morrison addressed his brother, "I believe you have some new arrests to make." But Charles Blackwood wasn't finished fighting. "You're all making a terrible mistake," he said, his voice rising. "These women are mentally unstable. They've bewitched this entire community with their lies and manipulations. You'll regret protecting them when the truth comes out." "The truth is coming out," Clayton said firmly, "and it's not the version you've been selling." William Blackwood, who had been growing increasingly agitated, suddenly spurred his horse forward. "Come on, Charles, we're leaving now." "No one's leaving until this is resolved," Sheriff Morrison said, his hand moving to his weapon. But William was already wheeling his horse around, and Charles, seeing the situation deteriorating rapidly, followed suit. The brothers spurred their mounts into a gallop, heading back toward town with the sheriff and his deputies in pursuit. The hired men, abandoned by their employers and facing potential accessory charges, raised their hands in surrender without being asked. In the sudden quiet that followed the dramatic departure, Clayton became aware of a sound he hadn't heard in years: Lavinia laughing. Not the polite laughter of social conversation, but the deep, joyous sound of a woman who had just been handed back her life. "They're gone," she said wonderingly. "They're actually gone." "For now," Judge Morrison cautioned. "But the Denver authorities will catch up with them soon enough. Men like that always think they're smarter than everyone else, right up until the cell door closes." Doc Patterson was already checking Ruth, who seemed to be in shock from the rapid turn of events. "She'll be fine," he assured Clayton and Lavinia. "Just needs time to process everything." "What happens now?" Clayton asked the judge. "Now we wait for the official documentation from Denver, but based on what I've seen, I'd say these ladies are about to become very wealthy women." Judge Morrison smiled at Lavinia and Ruth. "Your father's true will apparently left you not just his estate, but also ownership of several profitable businesses your brothers have been managing and from which they've been stealing for years." As the various officials departed to pursue the fleeing brothers and file their reports, Clayton found himself alone with the sisters for the first time since their ordeal had begun. They stood together in the yard of High Hollow Ranch, watching the dust settle from the horse's departure, all three of them trying to absorb what had just happened. "So you're rich women now," Clayton said finally. "It appears so," Lavinia replied, but her voice was oddly flat. "You don't sound happy about it." Ruth stirred from her shocked silence. "We're grateful, of course. Justice has been served, and we'll have our inheritance. But, Clayton prompted. Lavinia looked at him with eyes that held a sadness he hadn't expected. "But now we have to decide what to do with our new freedom. And somehow that seems almost as frightening as being prisoners of our brother's greed." Clayton felt the ground shifting beneath him again, just as it had when the sisters first arrived. They would leave now, of course. With their inheritance restored, they could go anywhere, do anything. They no longer needed the protection and shelter he'd offered. The thought of High Hollow Ranch returning to its former emptiness was almost unbearable. "You could stay," he heard himself saying. "You could make Montana your home." "Clayton," Lavinia said gently, "that's very kind, but we couldn't impose on you any longer now that we have the means to." "I'm not talking about imposition," Clayton interrupted. "I'm talking about marriage." The words hung in the air between them, bold and unexpected even to Clayton himself. But now that he'd said them, he realized they felt absolutely right. "Marriage?" Lavinia's voice was barely a whisper. "To me," Clayton clarified, as if there could be any doubt, "I know it's sudden, and I know you have options now that you didn't have before. But I also know that I love you, Lavinia Blackwood, and I'd be honored if you'd consider becoming my wife." Ruth was smiling through her tears, but Lavinia looked stunned. "Clayton, you need time to think about everything that's happened. Our whole world has just changed in the space of an hour." "Take all the time you need," Clayton said. "But while you're thinking, remember this money can buy you security and independence, but it can't buy you a home or a family. And that's what we've become, the three of us, a family." As they walked back toward the house together, Clayton realized that the brass compass hidden in Lavinia's satchel had served its purpose. It had guided her and Ruth through the wilderness of their troubles, through the darkness of their brother's betrayal, and finally to a place where they could find their way home. The question now was whether home meant Montana, or whether the compass would point them toward some distant horizon he couldn't follow. The telegram from his lawyer arrived 3 days later, and its contents hit Clayton like a physical blow. He sat in his study, reading the legal document that Miguel had brought from town, feeling the walls of his carefully built world closing in around him. High Hollow Ranch's home, his life's work, his legacy was mortgaged far more heavily than he'd remembered. The original deed contained a clause he'd forgotten about, inserted by the bank during the difficult early years when he'd needed capital to expand the operation. If he left the territory for more than 30 consecutive days, the bank could call in the full amount of the loan immediately. With the legal proceedings in Denver likely to take months, and Lavinia and Ruth needing his testimony to fully establish their case, Clayton would have to choose between helping the women he'd come to love and losing everything he'd spent 30 years building. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the damning document. The irony wasn't lost on him just as Lavinia and Ruth had regained their fortune. He was facing the possibility of losing his own. A soft knock at the study door interrupted his brooding. "Come in," he called, quickly folding the telegram and slipping it into his desk drawer. Lavinia entered, carrying a tea tray and wearing an expression of gentle concern. "Miguel said you received news from town. You looked troubled when you came in." "Nothing that can't be handled," Clayton lied, accepting the tea gratefully. "How's Ruth feeling today?" "Much better." Dr. Patterson was writher. Headaches were stress, related. Knowing that Charles and William are facing justice has lifted a tremendous weight from her shoulders. Lavinia settled into the chair across from his desk. "Clayton, we need to talk." "About?" "About your proposal, about what happens next." Clayton set down his teacup, his heart suddenly beating faster. "Have you made a decision?" "We've made several decisions, actually. Ruth and I have been discussing our situation extensively." Lavinia's voice was calm, but Clayton could see the emotion in her eyes. "First, we've decided to accept the inheritance and use it to honor our father's memory by establishing a foundation to help women in difficult circumstances. That's admirable. Second, we've decided that Montana has become home to us in a way Boston never was. We want to stay in the territory." Clayton felt a surge of hope. "And the third decision?" Lavinia smiled, and her entire face lit up. "The third decision is that I would be honored to become your wife, Clayton Rusk, if the offer still stands." Clayton was around the desk and pulling her into his arms before she'd finished speaking. "The offer will stand until my dying day," he murmured against her hair. "Are you sure, Lavinia?" You have your independence now, your freedom. Freedom means having choices, she said, pulling back to look into his eyes. And I choose you. I choose this life we could build together. Clayton kissed her then, gently at first, then with all the pent-up longing and hope of a man who'd thought he'd never love again. When they finally broke apart, Lavinia was laughing softly. Ruth is going to be so pleased, she said. She's been worried about me spending the rest of my life as a spinster. What about Ruth? What are her plans? She wants to stay here too, if you'll have her. This ranch has given her a sense of purpose she's never had before. She loves managing the household, working with the garden, helping with the books. She's found her calling here. Clayton thought about the telegram in his desk drawer and felt his happiness dim. Lavinia, there's something I need to tell you. Something that might change your mind about marrying a rancher. What could possibly? I might lose the ranch. Clayton explained the situation as gently as he could, watching Lavinia's face as she processed the implications. To her credit, she listened without interruption, her expression growing more thoughtful rather than alarmed. So if you come to Denver to testify on our behalf, you could lose High Hollow, she asked when he'd finished. Yes, and without the ranch, I'd have very little to offer you as a husband. Lavinia was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the land Clayton might soon lose. How much do you owe the bank? Lavinia, I don't want your money to... How much? Clayton sighed. $87,000. That's all? Clayton stared at her. That's all? Lavinia, that's more money than most men see in a lifetime. But it's not more money than we'll inherit from Father's estate, she said matter-of-factly. According to the preliminary estimates from the Denver lawyers, Ruth and I will inherit holdings worth at least $300,000, possibly more. I can't let you pay my debts. You can't stop me from investing in our future. Lavinia leaned forward, her eyes bright with determination. Clayton, this ranch isn't just your home, it's about to become mine too. And Ruth's. Why wouldn't we want to secure it? Because it would make me a fortune hunter who married you for your money. It would make you a practical man who married a practical woman. Lavinia reached across the desk and took his hands. Clayton, what did you think would happen to my inheritance after we married? Under the law, it would become yours anyway. I hadn't thought that far ahead. Well, I have. And I've thought about something else too. This ranch could be so much more than it already is. With proper investment, we could expand the operation, improve the breeding stock, maybe even add agricultural ventures. Ruth has wonderful ideas about developing the garden into a proper market operation. Clayton shook his head in amazement. You've been here less than a month, and you're already planning to revolutionize my business. Our business, Lavinia corrected. And yes, I am. Father always said that money should work, not just sit in banks earning modest interest. This ranch has enormous potential. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching at speed. Clayton looked out the window to see Doc Patterson riding hard toward the house, his medical bag bouncing against his saddle. Something's wrong, Clayton said, rising quickly. They met Doc on the porch, where he dismounted with obvious urgency. Clayton, we have a problem. Charles and William Blackwood, they didn't flee the territory. What do you mean? They've been hiding out at the old Miller place, about 20 miles north. Sheriff Morrison got a tip from one of the miners. They're gathering men-hired guns from Billings and Miles City. Word is they're planning to come back for the sisters. Legal consequences be damned. Lavinia had gone pale. How many men? At least a dozen, maybe more. And they're armed for war, not conversation. Clayton felt his military instincts kicking in. When? Tonight, most likely. They know the federal marshals are coming from Denver, so they want to grab the sisters and get out of the territory before the law catches up with them. Over my dead body, Clayton said grimly. That might be exactly what they have in mind, Doc replied. Charles Blackwood is telling anyone who'll listen that you've bewitched his sisters and stolen their inheritance. He's convinced himself that if he eliminates you, everything will go back to the way it was. Lavinia grabbed Clayton's arm. We have to leave. Right now, we can go to Denver ourselves. Get protection from the federal authorities. No, Clayton's voice was firm. Running just postpones the problem, and I won't be driven from my own land by a coward and his hired guns. Clayton, you can't fight a dozen armed men. I won't be alone. Clayton turned to Doc Patterson. How long do we have? 4 hours, maybe 5. They were still gathering men when my source left the Miller place. That's enough time. Clayton was already moving toward the barn. Miguel can spread the word to the ranch hands. Most of them are good men who know how to handle firearms. And I still remember a few things from my army days. Doc Patterson looked puzzled. Army days? Clayton served in the war between the states, Lavinia said quietly. He was a cavalry officer. I was more than that, Clayton admitted. I was a reconnaissance specialist, spent 3 years behind enemy lines, learning how to think like the enemy and use terrain to my advantage. As the afternoon wore on, High Hollow Ranch was transformed into a fortress. Clayton positioned his men strategically around the ranch buildings, turning the barn, bunkhouse, and main house into defensive positions. Miguel proved invaluable, his years of frontier experience complementing Clayton's military knowledge. "Senor," Miguel said, as they checked the ammunition supplies, "are you sure we shouldn't send the senoras away? This could get very dangerous." "They won't go," Clayton replied. "I already asked. Lavinia says she's tired of running, and Ruth refuses to leave her sister." Indeed, both women had insisted on staying and helping with the preparations. Lavinia proved surprisingly knowledgeable about firearms, while Ruth turned the main house into a medical station in case of injuries. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, Clayton found himself standing on the porch with Lavinia, both of them looking toward the northern hills where their enemies would soon appear. "Are you afraid?" she asked quietly. "Terrified," Clayton admitted. "Not of dying, I made my peace with that possibility years ago, but of losing you before we've had a chance to build something together." "You won't lose me," Lavinia said firmly. "We've come too far and overcome too much to let Charles and William destroy our future now." "I love you," Clayton said simply. "I love you too, and when this is over, we're going to have the most beautiful wedding Montana Territory has ever seen." As if summoned by their words, a lone rider appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the dying light. Clayton reached for his rifle, but as the figure drew closer, he recognized Thomas Brennan. "Clayton!" Thomas called out as he approached. "I heard what's happening. I've brought 6 of my best men, and we're here to help." Clayton felt a surge of gratitude for his neighbor's loyalty, especially considering that Thomas had been courting Lavinia just days before. "Thomas, this isn't your fight. Any fight that threatens decent folks is my fight," Thomas replied firmly. "Besides, I've been looking for an excuse to deal with those Blackwood brothers ever since they showed up in the territory spreading lies." As full darkness settled over the ranch, Clayton made his final preparations. He had 15 men total his own ranch hands, Thomas Brennan's crew, and Doc Patterson, who insisted on staying despite his age. It wasn't many against the force the Blackwood brothers had assembled, but they had the advantage of defending familiar ground. "Remember," Clayton told his men as they took their positions, "we're not trying to kill anyone if we can help it. We just want to convince them that attacking this ranch is a very bad idea." Miguel chuckled grimly. "See, patron, sometimes the best way to convince a man is to shoot near enough to his ear that he can hear the bullet sing." As they waited in the darkness, Clayton reflected on how much his life had changed since 2 desperate women had appeared at his gate asking for shelter. He'd thought he was simply offering charity to strangers in need. Instead, he'd found love, family, and a purpose beyond simply managing cattle and counting profits. Now, as he prepared to defend all of that against men who saw women as property and viewed kindness as weakness, Clayton realized that this battle was about more than just protecting Lavinia and Ruth. It was about defending the idea that people could start over, that the past didn't have to define the future, and that sometimes the family you chose was stronger than the one you were born into. In the distance, the sound of many horses approaching carried on the night wind. The Blackwood brothers were coming, and Clayton Rusk was ready for them. The attack never came. Clayton and his men waited through the long night, weapons ready and nerves stretched tight, but the Blackwood brothers and their hired guns never appeared. As dawn broke over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the only sounds were the normal ranch noise scattle lowing in the distance, horses nickering in the corral, and the cheerful whistle of Miguel preparing morning coffee. Maybe they changed their minds, Thomas Brennan suggested as they gathered on the porch, tired men grateful for hot coffee and the simple fact of being alive. Men like that don't change their minds, Clayton replied grimly. They're planning something else. Doc Patterson rode in just after sunrise, his face grim with news. Found out why they didn't come last night, he said without preamble. Charles and William Blackwood are dead. The coffee cup slipped from Lavinia's hands, shattering on the porch boards. Dead? How? Shot down by federal marshals about 10 miles north of here. Apparently they tried to ambush the law enforcement party that was coming to arrest them. Doc dismounted heavily, looking every one of his 60-plus years. Both brothers are gone, along with 3 of their hired men, the rest scattered to the winds. Ruth sank into a chair, her face pale with shock. It's over then, really over. It appears so, Doc confirmed. But there's more news, and you ladies need to prepare yourselves for it. Clayton felt a familiar chill of premonition. What kind of news? Ruth, when you were organizing Sarah's recipe book more carefully, did you examine every page thoroughly? I thought so. Why? Doc reached into his medical bag and withdrew a bundle of documents. Because the federal marshals found something interesting when they searched the brothers' hideout. It seems Charles and William weren't the only ones keeping secrets. He handed the papers to Lavinia, who unfolded them with trembling hands. As she read, her expression changed from confusion to amazement to something approaching awe. What is it? Clayton asked. It's another will, Lavinia said weakly, but not from father. This one is signed by Sarah Rusk. Clayton stared at her. That's impossible. Sarah never made a will. We discussed it, but... Read it, Doc said quietly. Clayton took the document and read it aloud, his voice growing stronger with each word. I, Sarah Elizabeth Rusk, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my most precious possession, my husband's happiness to 2 women who will someday need shelter from life's storms. Hidden within my recipe collection, they will find not just instructions for nourishing the body, but documents that will nourish their spirits and secure their future. To Lavinia and Ruth Blackwood, should this document ever be needed, I leave proof of your father's true wishes and the location of his final will. May you find in Montana the home and family that life has denied you elsewhere. The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Ruth spoke in a whisper. She knew. Somehow, Sarah knew we would come here. More than that, Doc said. She knew your father. They corresponded for years, not just through me, but directly. Jonathan Blackwood was dying of consumption, and he needed someone he could trust to safeguard his daughter's future. Clayton sank into a chair, trying to process what he was hearing. Sarah never told me, because she promised your father-in-law she wouldn't, unless it became necessary. Doc pulled out another document. This is the real reason Charles and William were so desperate to get their hands on their sisters. They discovered that Jonathan had hidden his true will not in Denver, but right here in Montana. And they knew that if you ever found it, their scheme would collapse completely. Lavinia was reading through the papers with growing amazement. There are investment records here, business documents, proof that father was worth far more than we ever imagined. And look at this. She held up a deed. He owned property in Colorado, California, even some mining interests in the Dakota Territory. How much are we talking about? Clayton asked. Doc smiled for the first time since arriving. According to the federal investigators who've been working with the Denver attorneys, the Blackwood estate is worth approximately $800,000. Ruth fainted. When she came around a few minutes later, supported by Lavinia and Doc Patterson, her first words were, "Did he say 800,000? He did, Lavinia confirmed, her own voice shaky with disbelief. That makes you 2 of the wealthiest women in the Western Territories. Doc continued, "But there's something else you need to know. Your father didn't just leave you money, he left you a mission." He handed them another document, this one written in Jonathan Blackwood's careful script. "To my beloved daughters, I have failed you in life by allowing your brothers to believe they were more valuable than you simply because of their gender. I hope to redeem myself in death by ensuring you have the means to help other women who face similar injustices. Use this inheritance wisely, not just for yourselves, but for those who have no one else to turn to. Build something lasting, something that will make the world better for your having been in it." Clayton watched the sisters as they absorbed their father's final message, seeing in their faces the weight of responsibility that came with great wealth. "What will you do?" he asked quietly. Lavinia looked up at him, her eyes bright with purpose. "We'll do what Father asked. We'll build something lasting." She stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the ranch that had become her home. "But we'll build it here, in Montana, where people believe in second chances and new beginnings." "You still want to stay?" Clayton asked, hardly daring to hope. "More than ever," Lavinia replied firmly. "This inheritance gives us the means to do something meaningful with our lives. We could establish schools for women, create opportunities for education and employment, maybe even start a bank that lends to people traditional banks won't consider." Ruth had recovered enough to join the conversation. "I've been thinking about something similar. With $800,000, we could buy land, establish a community where women could live independently if they chose to, or where families could start over without fear of judgment or persecution." Clayton felt his heart swell with pride and love for these remarkable women. "You're talking about changing the entire territory." "Why not?" Lavinia said with a smile. "Father always said that money without purpose was just pretty paper, and we have a very clear purpose now." "What about us?" Clayton asked quietly. "What about marriage and family?" Lavinia returned to his side and took his hands. "Clayton Rusk, I believe I've found a man who shares my vision of what the future could be. A man who opened his home to strangers and was willing to fight to protect them. A man who sees women as partners, not property." She smiled. "If that man is still interested in marrying a woman with strong opinions and deep pockets, then I'd say our future looks very bright indeed." "Very bright," Clayton agreed, pulling her into his arms. Thomas Brennan, who had been listening to the entire conversation with growing amazement, finally spoke up. "Ladies, if you're serious about establishing new communities and helping people start over, I'd like to discuss selling you some of my land. I've been thinking about moving closer to Billings anyway, and it sounds like you could put my acres to better use than I ever could." As the day progressed, word of the Blackwood brothers' death and the sisters' inheritance spread throughout the territory. People came from miles around to offer congratulations, express condolences, and in many cases stow hint at business opportunities and investment possibilities. But it was Miguel who asked the question that mattered most. "Senora Lavinia, with all this money and all these plans, will you still need an old vaquero who knows how to manage cattle?" "Miguel," Lavinia said warmly, "we'll need you more than ever. Someone has to teach all the new residents how to survive in Montana." That evening, as the sun set over High Hollow Ranch, Clayton and Lavinia stood on the porch where they'd shared their first honest conversation about love and the future. Everything had changed in the space of a single day, yet somehow everything felt exactly as it should be. "Are you sure about this?" Clayton asked. "About staying here? About marrying a simple rancher when you could go anywhere and do anything?" "Clayton," Lavinia said, leaning against his shoulder, "I spent 52 years looking for home. I finally found it in the kindness of a man who saw two desperate women and offered them shelter without asking what they could give him in return. Why would I ever want to leave? Because now you have choices you never had before." "Exactly, and I choose this. I choose you. I choose the life we can build together." In the kitchen, Ruth was carefully placing Sarah's recipe book back in its honored place, but now it rested beside a new collection, the legal documents that had secured their freedom and their future. The brass compass that had guided them through their darkest hours sat on the windowsill, its needle pointing steadily north toward the mountains that would forever mean home to the Blackwood sisters. As Clayton and Lavinia planned their wedding for the following month, they also began planning something much larger, a community where people could start over, where women could own property and businesses, where families could build new lives free from the restrictions and prejudices of more settled places. They would call it New Hope, and it would be Sarah Rusk's legacy as much as Jonathan Blackwood's. A place where recipe books could hide important documents, where strangers could become family, and where love could bloom, even in the autumn of life. The war was over, but the real adventure was just beginning. The discovery of Clayton's military service medal came about by accident, much like everything else that had shaped their remarkable story. Ruth was helping him pack away some of Sarah's belongings that had been stored in the bedroom closet when the small wooden box fell from a high shelf, spilling its contents across the floor. Among the scattered momentous letters, a pressed flower, a child's drawing lay, a tarnished bronze medal attached to a faded ribbon. Lavinia picked it up, examining the inscription with growing amazement. "Clayton," she called softly, "could you come here for a moment?" He appeared in the doorway, saw the medal in her hands, and went very still. "You weren't supposed to find that." "The Medal of Honor?" Lavinia's voice carried a note of awe. "Clayton, this is the highest military decoration the country awards. What did you do to earn this?" Clayton sat heavily on the edge of the bed, looking older than his 57 years. "Something I've spent 25 years trying to forget." "Will you tell us?" Ruth asked gently, settling beside him with the careful attention of a woman who understood that some stories came with a cost. Clayton was quiet for a long moment, his hands working unconsciously, as if he were still holding reins or a rifle. It was during the war, near the end. Confederate forces had captured a Union supply train carrying medical supplies desperately needed for our wounded. The supplies were being held in a fortified position that our commanders said was impossible to assault directly. He paused, lost in memories that clearly still haunted him. "I volunteered to go in alone, at night, to recover what I could. The plan was to create a distraction, set some fires, maybe steal a wagon or two of medicine. But something went wrong," Lavinia guessed. "Something went right, actually, better than anyone expected." Clayton's voice grew distant. "When I got inside their perimeter, I discovered they weren't just holding our medical supplies. They had captured 15 Union soldiers, wounded men who would have died without treatment. The Confederate commander was planning to use them as leverage in prisoner exchanges." Ruth leaned forward, caught up in the story despite its obvious pain for Clayton. "What did you do?" "I had a choice. Take the medical supplies and escape, completing my mission and probably saving dozens of lives back at our field hospital. Or risk everything to free 15 men who might not survive, even if I succeeded." "You chose the men," Lavinia said quietly. Clayton nodded. "I chose the men. Spent 3 hours moving through that camp, cutting bonds, gathering weapons, organizing an escape route. When we finally made our break, it turned into a running battle that lasted until dawn." "Did you all make it out?" 13 of the 15 survived, and yes, we managed to bring most of the medical supplies with us." Clayton's voice grew even quieter, but the cost was high. "I killed 7 men that night, including a Confederate officer who couldn't have been older than 20. I can still remember his face." The 3 of them sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of what Clayton had shared. Finally, Lavinia spoke. "You saved 13 lives." "I took 7. "You made an impossible choice and lived with the consequences," she corrected gently. "That's what leaders do." Clayton looked at her with something approaching surprise. "Most people see the medal and think I'm some kind of hero." "You are a hero," Ruth said firmly. "But you're also a man who understands the real cost of difficult decisions. That's exactly the kind of person we need, leading us through what's coming next." "What's coming next?" Lavinia stood and walked to the window, looking out at the ranch that had become the center of their new world. "Clayton, establishing New Hope isn't going to be simple. We'll face opposition from people who don't want change, legal challenges from those who profit from the current system, and practical problems we haven't even imagined yet. Not to mention, Ruth added, there are already rumors that some of the territorial political leaders aren't happy about the idea of a community where women can own property independently. Clayton joined Lavinia at the window. What kind of rumors? Doc Patterson heard talk in Billings. Some of the established ranchers and businessmen are worried that our success might encourage other women to demand similar rights elsewhere. They see us as a threat to the natural order. And they're right. Lavinia said with a smile that held no apology. We are a threat to their version of the natural order. The question is whether we're prepared to defend our vision against their opposition. Clayton thought about the medal lying on the bed behind them, about the weight of command and the necessity of making hard choices. What kind of opposition are we talking about? Economic pressure, legal challenges, social ostracism. Lavinia ticked off the possibilities on her fingers. And if those don't work, there are always men willing to use more direct methods to maintain their advantages. You're talking about violence. I'm talking about reality, Lavinia replied. Clayton, we're proposing to use $800,000 to create a community that challenges everything powerful men in this territory believe about women, property, and social order. Did you really think they'd simply congratulate us and offer to help? Ruth had been quietly organizing the spilled contents of the memory box, but now she looked up with an expression of determination that surprised them both. I've been thinking about this a lot, actually, about what we're really trying to do here. Which is, we're not just creating a place for women to live independently. We're creating proof that women can manage property, run businesses, make important decisions, all the things men claim we can't do. Ruth's voice grew stronger as she spoke. Every success we have undermines their arguments for keeping us dependent. Clayton began to understand the full scope of what they were contemplating. You're not just building a community, you're starting a revolution. A quiet revolution, Lavinia corrected, but a revolution nonetheless. And revolutions require leaders who understand strategy, who can make hard decisions under pressure, who won't fold when the opposition gets serious. Leaders like Medal of Honor recipients, Ruth added pointedly. Clayton looked at these two remarkable women who had transformed his life so completely and felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders. It was a feeling he'd thought he'd left behind with his uniform, but now he recognized it as something he'd been missing without realizing it. All right, he said finally. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. What's our first strategic priority? Lavinia's smile was brilliant. Securing legal protection for our plans before word spreads too widely. Judge Morrison has been helpful, but we need federal backing for some of what we want to accomplish. Such as charter for the bank, official recognition of New Hope as an incorporated community, legal framework for women's property ownership that can't be challenged by territorial authorities. Clayton nodded, his military mind already working through the logistics. That means trips to Denver and possibly Washington. How long do we have before local opposition organizes against us? Not long, Ruth said. Miguel mentioned that some of the ranch hands have been hearing talk in town. Nothing specific yet, but the kind of grumbling that usually precedes organized action. Then we move fast and we move smart. Clayton picked up the medal from the bed, studying it for a moment, before placing it carefully back in the memory box. I'll contact some old army friends who are now in politics. Military connections can be useful when you need federal attention quickly. Over the next several days, High Hollow Ranch became a center of intense activity. Telegrams flew to Denver, Cheyenne, and Washington as Clayton activated connections he hadn't used in years. Lavinia worked with territorial attorneys to draft incorporation papers for New Hope, while Ruth began the practical work of surveying potential sites for their new community. Thomas Brennan proved invaluable during this period, not just for his willingness to sell land, but for his knowledge of local politics and personalities. You'll want to watch out for Marcus Webb, he warned during one planning session. He owns the largest bank in Billings, and has political ambitions. He won't appreciate competition, especially from women. How much influence does he have? Clayton asked. Enough to cause problems. He's connected to the territorial governor, has investments in most of the major ranches, and controls credit for a lot of smaller operations. Thomas paused thoughtfully. He's also not above using intimidation when financial pressure doesn't work. What kind of intimidation? The kind that involves men riding out to have conversations with people who don't see things his way. Clayton felt his old instinct stirring. How many men? Usually 4 or 5. Nothing too obvious, just enough to make the point that continued opposition might be unhealthy. And the territorial law enforcement? Thomas's expression was grim. Webb has the sheriff in his pocket. Official complaints tend to get lost in paperwork. That evening, Clayton called a meeting with all the ranch hands, explaining the situation and giving each man a choice about whether to stay for what might become a difficult period. "Senor Clayton," Miguel said when he'd finished, "I rode with you for 20 years through drought, blizzards, and market crashes. You think I'm going to ride away now when you need me most?" One by one, the other men voiced similar sentiments. These were people who had benefited from Clayton's fair treatment over the years, and they weren't about to abandon him now. "There's something else," Clayton told them. "We're not just defending the ranch anymore. We're defending the idea that all people deserve the chance to build something better for themselves and their families." "Sounds like a cause worth fighting for," said Jake Morrison, the youngest of the hands. "What do you need us to do?" Clayton looked around at these men who had chosen to stand with him, feeling the familiar surge of responsibility and determination that had carried him through the war years. "First, we increase security around the ranch. No one rides alone, everyone goes armed, and we establish regular patrol schedules." "And second?" Miguel asked. "Second, we start training some of the women in the territory who want to be part of New Hope. If they're going to face opposition, they need to know how to defend themselves and their property." Lavinia, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. "I volunteer to be the first student." Over the following weeks, High Hollow Ranch took on the atmosphere of a military training camp. Clayton taught basic firearms safety and defensive tactics to a growing group of women who had heard about New Hope and wanted to be part of it. Ruth surprised everyone by proving to be an excellent marksman, while Lavinia demonstrated a natural aptitude for tactical thinking. "You realize," Clayton told Lavinia one evening as they practiced with revolvers behind the barn, "that word of these training sessions is going to reach Webb and his allies soon." "Good," Lavinia replied, reloading with practiced efficiency. "Let them know we're not helpless victims waiting to be intimidated. It might also accelerate their timeline for taking action against us. Then we'd better be ready when they come." Clayton watched her sight down the barrel at a distant target, her stance steady and her expression focused. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate refugee with nothing but the clothes on her back. Now she was preparing for what might be the fight of her life, and doing it with the calm determination of a born strategist. "Are you sure about this path we're taking?" he asked quietly. "It's not too late to choose something safer, something easier." Lavinia lowered the revolver and turned to face him. "Clayton, I spent 52 years playing it safe, letting other people make decisions about my life. I have no intention of spending whatever years I have left doing the same thing, even if it means risking everything we've built together. Especially if it means risking everything we've built together." She smiled and kissed him gently. "Some things are worth fighting for. Love is one of them. Justice is another. And the chance to build something that will outlast us both, that's worth any risk." As autumn deepened toward winter, the sense of impending confrontation grew stronger. Federal approval for their banking charter was proceeding smoothly, thanks to Clayton's military connections, but local opposition was organizing more openly. Webb had begun making inquiries about the legal basis for women's property ownership, while several established ranchers had started questioning the territorial government about outside agitators disrupting traditional social structures. The climax of their struggle was approaching, and everyone involved knew it. The only questions were when it would come, what form it would take, and whether the small group of idealists at High Hollow Ranch would be ready for whatever their opponents chose to throw at them. Clayton checked his weapons one more time, reviewed his defensive plans, and prepared to protect everything that mattered to him in the world. The Medal of Honor winner who had once saved 13 men in a Confederate prison camp was about to discover whether his tactical skills could save the future he'd never dared to dream of having. The territorial courthouse in Billings had never seen a legal proceeding quite like the one that convened on the crisp morning of November 15th, 1887. Judge Morrison presided from his bench with the gravity of a man who understood that the decisions made in this room would echo far beyond the borders of Montana Territory. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity. Word of the hearing had spread throughout the territory, drawing supporters and opponents of the New Hope project from hundreds of miles away. Women sat in the gallery alongside ranchers, merchants, and politicians, all of them understanding that what happened here would determine whether the vision of Lavinia and Ruth Blackwood would become reality or remain a dream. Clayton sat in the front row behind the plaintiff's table, his dress uniform bearing the ribbons and decorations of his military service. Beside him, Doc Patterson reviewed medical testimony about the sisters' mental competence, while Thomas Brennan and Miguel flanked the other women who had joined the New Hope project. At the defense table, Marcus Webb commanded an impressive array of legal talent. 3 attorneys from Denver, 2 territorial prosecutors, and a representative from the Federal Land Office sat prepared to challenge every aspect of the sisters' legal standing and their proposed community. "Your Honor," began Harrison Fletcher, the lead attorney for the opposition, "we are here today to address a matter that strikes at the very foundation of civilized society, the attempt by these women to establish what they euphemistically call a community, but which is in reality a dangerous precedent that would undermine the natural order of family and property relations throughout the territory." Judge Morrison listened impassively as Fletcher outlined the opposition's case. The attorney argued that allowing women to own property independently would destabilize marriages, corrupt the moral fabric of society, and create legal complications that the territorial government was unprepared to handle. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Fletcher continued, "we have evidence that suggests these women and their supporters are not merely seeking to establish a legitimate community, but are engaged in a deliberate campaign to subvert territorial authority and federal law." "What evidence?" Judge Morrison asked sharply. Fletcher presented a series of documents, reports from private investigators, statements from territorial officials, and testimony from concerned citizens who claimed to have witnessed suspicious activities at High Hollow Ranch. "We have sworn statements that Mr. Clayton Rusk has been conducting military training exercises with groups of women, ostensibly for self-defense, but clearly designed to create an armed force capable of resisting lawful authority." Clayton felt his jaw tighten, but he remained silent as his attorney, James Whitmore, rose to respond. "Your Honor, Mr. Rusk is a decorated veteran with every right to teach firearms safety and defensive tactics to law-abiding citizens. The opposition seems to believe that women learning to protect themselves constitute some form of insurrection. The opposition believes," Fletcher shot back, "that arming women and training them in military tactics suggests intentions that go far beyond the establishment of a peaceful agricultural community." Judge Morrison called for order as murmurs swept through the courtroom. "Mr. Fletcher, do you have specific evidence that laws have been broken, or are you simply objecting to activities that make you uncomfortable?" "Your Honor, we have evidence that these women have been conducting secret meetings, gathering intelligence on legitimate business operations, and actively recruiting other women to abandon their proper roles in society." "Secret meetings?" Whitmore rose again. "Your Honor, the opposition is describing normal business planning and community organization as if it was some form of conspiracy." The morning progressed with a parade of witnesses called by the opposition. Marcus Webb himself took the stand, describing his concerns about the economic impact of the proposed community. "Your Honor," Webb testified, "the establishment of this so-called New Hope would create unfair competition for legitimate banking and business interests in the territory. These women claim to have substantial funds, but we have no verification of the source of this wealth or assurance that it was obtained legally." Whitmore cross-examined Webb methodically. "Mr. Webb, are you suggesting that the Blackwood inheritance is somehow illegitimate?" "I'm suggesting that large sums of money appearing suddenly in the hands of women with no established business experience deserve scrutiny. The federal authorities in Denver have verified the legitimacy of the inheritance. Are you questioning federal judgment?" Webb's face reddened. "I'm questioning whether women are capable of managing such substantial assets responsibly." "I see. And what qualifications do you possess that make you a better judge of financial responsibility than, say, Miss Lavinia Blackwood, who successfully reorganized the business records of one of the territory's largest ranches?" The questions continued, with Webb growing increasingly flustered as Whitmore exposed the weak foundations of his objections. By the time the banker left the stand, it was clear that his opposition was based more on prejudice than legitimate concern. The afternoon session brought testimony from the sisters themselves. Lavinia took the stand first, her composure unshakable despite the hostile atmosphere from the opposition's supporters. "Miss Blackwood," Whitmore began, "please tell the court about your educational background and business experience." Lavinia spoke clearly and confidently about her education, her years managing household finances for her father, and her recent work organizing Clayton's ranch operations. She presented a detailed business plan for New Hope, complete with financial projections, legal structures, and plans for sustainable development. "Miss Blackwood," Fletcher cross-examined, "don't you think it's presumptuous for unmarried women to believe they can successfully manage a community when they have no experience in marriage or family responsibilities?" "Mr. Fletcher," Lavinia replied calmly, "I would suggest that 30 years of managing a household, overseeing servants, organizing social functions, and handling financial responsibilities has given me exactly the experience needed to manage a community. The only difference is that now I'm doing it with legal recognition rather than as an invisible assistant to male relatives. But surely you understand that women are naturally suited to supportive roles rather than leadership positions. I understand that men have convinced themselves this is true because it serves their interests. I see no evidence that gender determines leadership ability." The courtroom erupted in mixed cheers and boos, forcing Judge Morrison to bang his gavel repeatedly for order. Ruth's testimony was equally compelling. She spoke about her experience managing the domestic operations of High Hollow Ranch, her plans for agricultural development in New Hope, and her vision of a community where women could pursue education and business opportunities. "Miss Ruth," Fletcher pressed during cross-examination, "don't you worry that encouraging women to abandon their traditional roles will lead to the breakdown of family structures?" "Mr. Fletcher," Ruth replied quietly, "I worry more about the breakdown that occurs when half the population is denied the opportunity to contribute their full talents to society." The most dramatic moment of the day came when Clayton took the stand. His military bearing and obvious competence made a strong impression on the courtroom as he testified about the sisters' character, their legitimate business plans, and the groundless nature of the opposition's concerns. "Mr. Rusk," Fletcher attacked aggressively, "isn't it true that you stand to benefit financially from this proposed community?" "I stand to benefit from marrying a woman I love and respect," Clayton replied firmly. "Her wealth is incidental to that. But surely you recognize the irregularity of women controlling such substantial assets." Clayton's eyes grew cold. "Mr. Fletcher, I've seen women run hospitals during wartime, manage plantations when their husbands were away fighting, and hold families together through circumstances that would break many men. The only irregularity I see is the legal system's failure to recognize what women have always been capable of. You don't find it concerning that these women are challenging established social structures?" "I find it long overdue." Fletcher pressed harder. "Mr. Rusk, You've been training women in military tactics. Isn't that preparation for armed resistance against lawful authority? Clayton leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. Mr. Fletcher, I've been teaching women to protect themselves and their property. If you find that threatening, perhaps you should examine why you believe women defending themselves poses a danger to lawful authority. The courtroom fell silent as the implications of Clayton's words sank in. Even Judge Morrison looked impressed by the quiet strength of his response. As the day's testimony concluded, it was clear that the battle lines were firmly drawn. The opposition had presented their case based on tradition, social order, and fear of change. The supporters of New Hope had countered with evidence of competence, detailed planning, and a vision of expanded opportunity. But everyone in the courtroom understood that this was about more than one community or one group of women. This was about whether the frontier spirit of Montana Territory included room for new definitions of family, property, and social structure. As the participants filed out of the courthouse, Clayton noticed groups of men gathering in hushed conversations on the street corners. The legal battle might be proceeding in an orderly fashion, but he recognized the signs of other kinds of pressure being organized. That evening, back at High Hollow Ranch, the core group gathered to assess the day's proceedings and prepare for what everyone sensed would be a crucial second day of hearings. "How do you think we did?" Ruth asked, still wound tight from the stress of testifying. "Better than I expected," Whitmore replied honestly. "Fletcher's case is weaker than he pretends, and Judge Morrison seems genuinely interested in the legal merits rather than the social implications." "But," Clayton prompted, hearing the lawyer's uncertainty, "but this isn't just a legal matter anymore. Webb and his allies aren't going to accept defeat gracefully, regardless of what the judge decides." As if summoned by his words, Miguel appeared in the doorway with news that confirmed everyone's fears. "Patron," he said grimly, "riders approaching from the south. At least a dozen men, moving slow and deliberate-like." Clayton was already reaching for his rifle. "How long?" 10 minutes, maybe 15. "Armed?" "See. And they're not trying to hide it." Clayton looked around at the people gathered in his parlor, women who had dared to dream of something better, the men who had chosen to support that dream, and the future that hung in the balance. "Well," he said with grim humor, "it appears Mr. Webb has decided that if he can't win in court, he'll try to win in the field." The final confrontation was about to begin. The confrontation unfolded differently than anyone expected. As the dozen riders approached High Hollow Ranch in the gathering dusk, Clayton positioned his people strategically around the buildings, but instead of the violent showdown everyone anticipated, the lead rider called out from a safe distance. "Clayton Rusk, this is Sheriff Ben Morrison. I need to speak with you." Clayton emerged from the house, rifle in hand, but not raised. Behind him, Lavinia and Ruth stood in the doorway, while his ranch hands took defensive positions around the yard. "Evening, Ben," Clayton called back. "Seems like a lot of men for a social call." Sheriff Morrison dismounted slowly, his hands visible and away from his weapons. "Clayton, I've got a warrant here for the arrest of Marcus Webb on charges of conspiracy, intimidation, and attempting to subvert territorial justice." The words hung in the evening air like smoke from a distant fire. Clayton felt the ground shift beneath him as he processed what he'd just heard. "Come again?" "Webb's been arrested," Morrison continued, walking closer. "Turns out Judge Morrison's been conducting his own investigation into some of the opposition's activities. Found evidence that Webb's been bribing territorial officials, threatening witnesses, and organizing what amounts to a private militia to intimidate supporters of your New Hope project." Clayton looked past the sheriff at the other riders, recognizing several as federal marshals rather than local hired guns. "And the rest of Webb's allies?" 5 arrests so far, with more warrants being issued. Turns out your legal battle stirred up a hornet's nest of corruption that's been festering in territorial politics for years. Doc Patterson emerged from the barn where he'd been waiting with several of the women from town. "Ben, what kind of evidence are we talking about?" The kind that comes from keeping detailed records of bribes paid and threats made, Sheriff Morrison replied with grim satisfaction. Webb apparently believed his own rhetoric about women being too emotional and disorganized to pose a real threat. He kept written records of everything, including plans to use force if legal methods failed. Lavinia stepped forward, her voice carrying a note of steel. "Sheriff, are you telling us that our opponents have been arrested for attempting to do exactly what they accused us of planning?" "Yes, ma'am. Seems like projection is a common failing among men who can't imagine that their opponents might actually be operating within the law." One of the federal marshals, a lean man with graying hair, dismounted and approached Clayton. "Mr. Rusk? Marshal William Hayes. I understand you're the tactical advisor for this New Hope community. I suppose you could say that." "Well, sir, I wanted to thank you personally. The intelligence gathering and documentation your people provided about Webb's activities was instrumental in building our case against him." Clayton looked puzzled. "What intelligence gathering?" Marshal Hayes smiled. "The detailed reports about threatening visits, intimidation tactics, and corrupt business practices that were forwarded to our office through official channels. Very professional work." Clayton turned to look at Lavinia, who was wearing an expression of carefully controlled innocence. "Lavinia, what did you do?" "I wrote letters," she said simply, "to federal authorities, territorial officials, and anyone else who might be interested in knowing about the illegal activities we were witnessing. I may have mentioned that my husband-to-be was a decorated military officer who could verify the accuracy of my observations. You've been conducting an intelligence operation." "I've been documenting crimes and reporting them to appropriate authorities," she corrected. "Isn't that what law-abiding citizens are supposed to do?" Ruth joined the conversation with her own small smile. "I may have helped with the record-keeping. Father always said that accurate documentation was the foundation of any successful business venture." Marshal Hayes nodded approvingly. "Ladies, your reports were so thorough and well-organized that we were able to build airtight cases against 6 different individuals. Webb's organization is completely dismantled." Sheriff Morrison pulled out a thick envelope. "Which brings me to the other reason I'm here. Judge Morrison asked me to deliver this personally." Clayton opened the envelope and read the official document inside, his expression changing from confusion to amazement to pure joy. "What is it?" Lavinia asked. "Official territorial recognition for the incorporation of New Hope as an independent community, with full legal authority to establish its own governance, banking systems, and property laws." Clayton looked up at her with wonder. "It's everything we asked for and more." "How is that possible?" Ruth asked. "The hearing isn't even finished." Marshal Hayes answered. "When Webb's conspiracy came to light, it became clear that the opposition to your project was based on illegal interference rather than legitimate legal concerns. Judge Morrison reviewed all the evidence and concluded that your incorporation should be approved immediately." "There's more," Sheriff Morrison added. "The territorial governor has formally apologized for the harassment you've endured and has promised full territorial support for your community development project." As the news sank in, Clayton felt the weight of months of tension and worry lifting from his shoulders. They had won not just the legal battle, but the larger war for the right to build something new and better. "Marshal Hayes," Lavinia said thoughtfully, "what happens to Webb's business interests, his bank, his property holdings?" "Excellent question. His assets are being seized as part of the criminal proceedings. They'll eventually be sold to satisfy his debts and legal obligations." "Would it be possible for New Hope to submit a bid for those assets?" The marshal raised an eyebrow. "You're interested in purchasing a bank from a man who tried to destroy you?" "I'm interested in ensuring that the banking services in this territory are provided by people who believe in equal treatment for all customers." Lavinia replied firmly, "And yes, there's a certain poetic justice in the idea." "I think that could be arranged," Marshal Hayes said with obvious admiration. "You people certainly don't think small." As the official party prepared to leave, Sheriff Morrison had one final piece of news. "Oh, and Clayton, Judge Morrison wants to see you in his chambers tomorrow morning. Something about a federal appointment. he thinks you might be interested in. What kind of appointment? Territorial marshal, with specific responsibility for ensuring that federal civil rights laws are enforced equally for all citizens. Apparently, your military record and recent demonstration of leadership under pressure have impressed some important people in Washington. After the officials departed, the core group gathered in Clayton's study to absorb what had just happened. The room was quiet except for the crackling of the fire and the soft sound of papers rustling as they reviewed the official documents. "We won," Ruth said finally, as if testing the words. "We won," Lavinia confirmed, but her voice carried a note of something beyond simple victory. Clayton looked at these two remarkable women who had transformed his life so completely. "What happens now?" "Now we build," Lavinia said firmly. "We build the community we envisioned, the bank that will serve everyone fairly, and the future our father dreamed of when he left us the means to make it happen. And we prove," Ruth added, "that women can not only manage large enterprises successfully, but can do so with more integrity than the men who tried to stop us." Clayton stood and walked to the window, looking out at the land that would soon become home to New Hope, place where people could start over, where women could own property and run businesses, where families could build new lives free from the restrictions of more settled places. "There's one more thing we need to do," he said quietly. "What's that?" Lavinia asked. Clayton turned back to face them, his expression serious but his eyes bright with love and determination. "We need to get married. Because I have no intention of facing whatever challenges come next without you as my wife." Lavinia rose and walked to him, placing her hands on his chest and looking up into his face. "Clayton Rusk, I've been ready to marry you since the day you chose to protect us, instead of turning us away. The only question is when." "How about Christmas?" Ruth suggested with a smile. "It seems appropriate to start our new life at the beginning of a new year." "Christmas it is," Clayton agreed, pulling Lavinia into his arms. "And our first act as a married couple will be to break ground for New Hope." Outside, the Montana wind carried the scent of snow and the promise of winter, but inside the warm house at High Hollow Ranch, three people who had found family in the most unlikely circumstances began planning a future that would have seemed impossible just months before. The brass compass that had guided the Blackwood sisters through their darkest hours now sat on the mantelpiece, its needle pointing steadily toward true north, toward home, toward hope, and toward the proof that sometimes the best families are the ones you choose rather than the ones you're born into. Christmas Day, 1887, dawned clear and cold over the Montana territory, with snow sparkling like diamonds across the valley floor. Inside the main house at High Hollow Ranch, the preparations for what would become legendary as the finest wedding the territory had ever seen were reaching their crescendo. Lavinia stood before the mirror in what had once been Sarah Rusk's bedroom, wearing a dress of deep blue silk that Ruth had somehow managed to order from Denver and have delivered in time for the ceremony. Her auburn hair, now openly showing its silver threads, was arranged in an elegant style that spoke to her natural grace and hard-won dignity. "Are you nervous?" Ruth asked, adjusting the delicate lace collar that had belonged to their mother. "Terrified," Lavinia admitted with a laugh. "Not about marrying Clayton, that's the surest decision I've ever made, but about everything that comes after. Building New Hope, managing the bank, proving that we can do everything we've promised to do. We've already proven more than most people thought possible," Ruth reminded her gently, "and we've done it together. Why would the future be any different?" From downstairs came the sound of voices and laughter as guests continued to arrive. The wedding had drawn people from hundreds of miles away, federal officials, territorial leaders, fellow ranchers, and dozens of women who saw in Lavinia and Clayton's union a symbol of possibilities they'd never dared to imagine. Judge Morrison would perform the ceremony, with Doc Patterson serving as Clayton's best man, and Thomas Brennan, who had graciously overcome any disappointment about Lavinia's choice, handling the logistics of the celebration. Miguel had taken charge of the feast, combining his own culinary traditions with recipes from Sarah's treasured cookbook. A soft knock at the door announced Clayton's arrival. "May I come in?" he called softly. "It's bad luck to see the bride before the ceremony," Ruth protested, but she was smiling as she said it. "I think we've had enough bad luck for one lifetime," Clayton replied, entering the room in his finest suit, looking every inch the distinguished gentleman and war hero he was. "Besides, I have something that belongs to both of you." He handed Lavinia a small wrapped package. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was their father's brass compass, but now it had been mounted in a beautiful silver frame with an inscription that read, "To my beloved daughters, who found their way home, Jonathan Blackwood, and to the family they chose to join them, Clayton and Sarah Rusk." "When did you have this made?" Lavinia asked, tears sparkling in her eyes. "I've been working on it with the silversmith in Billings since we got engaged," Clayton replied. "Sarah would have wanted you to have something that honored both families, the one you were born into and the one you're choosing now." Ruth was openly crying now, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "It's perfect. Father would be so proud of what we've accomplished." "He'd be proud of what you're going to accomplish," Clayton corrected. "This is just the beginning." The ceremony itself was simple but deeply moving. Lavinia and Clayton exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising not just to love and honor each other, but to work together in building a community that would serve as an example of what was possible when people were given the freedom to pursue their dreams. "I promise," Clayton said, his voice carrying clearly through the crowded parlor, "to stand beside you as an equal partner in all our endeavors, to support your ambitions as enthusiastically as my own, and to help you prove that the frontier spirit includes room for everyone willing to work hard and dream big." "I promise," Lavinia responded, "to bring the same dedication to our marriage that I bring to everything else I care about, to challenge you to be your best self even as you help me become mine, and to build with you a legacy that will outlast us both." When Judge Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up could be heard for miles across the valley. The celebration continued well into the evening, with speeches, toasts, and stories that would be retold for generations. Doc Patterson shared memories of Sarah Rusk and her conviction that the ranch would someday be filled with laughter again. Miguel offered a blessing in both Spanish and English, asking for prosperity and happiness for the new family. Thomas Brennan raised his glass to the courage to build something new on the foundation of something good. But it was Ruth who gave the most memorable speech of the evening. "6 months ago," she said, standing before the assembled guests with a confidence that would have been unthinkable when she first arrived at High Hollow, "my sister and I were refugees from our own family, running from brothers who saw us as property to be managed rather than people to be respected. We had nothing but each other and a desperate hope that somewhere in this vast territory we might find a place to start over." She paused, looking around at the faces gathered in the warm parlor faces that had become family, friends, and partners in a dream that was rapidly becoming reality. "We found more than we ever dared to hope for. We found a man who saw our worth before we fully believed in it ourselves. We found a community that valued contribution over convention. And we found the chance to build something that will make life better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us." Ruth raised her glass higher. "To Clayton and Lavinia Rusk, may your marriage be as strong as your partnership, and may New Hope be everything you've envisioned and more." As the guests lifted their glasses in response, Lavinia felt the weight and wonder of how much had changed since that desperate night when she and Ruth had first appeared at Clayton's gate. Then, they had been 2 frightened women with nothing to offer but hard work and the plea to simply be allowed to stay. Now, she was Mrs. Clayton Rusk, co-founder of New Hope and part owner of what would soon become the most progressive bank in the Montana Territory. Later that evening, as the last guests departed and the house grew quiet, the 3 of them now officially family sat together on the porch, despite the cold, watching the stars emerge over the mountains that had become home. "What's our first priority for New Hope?" Clayton asked, his arm around his new wife's shoulders. Housing, Lavinia said immediately. We need to build proper homes for the families who want to join us, and a school. Education has to be one of our founding principles. The bank, Ruth added. People need to know they can access fair credit and financial services regardless of their gender or social status. Infrastructure, Clayton contributed. Roads, water systems, basic services that will allow the community to grow sustainably. They talked long into the night, planning and dreaming and laying the groundwork for what would become one of the most successful and progressive communities in the American West. By the time they finally went inside, they had outlined plans that would keep them busy for years to come. As Lavinia prepared for bed in what was now truly her own home, she caught sight of the new family portrait that sat on the dresser where Clayton's damaged photograph of Sarah and the girls had once been. The new picture showed the three of them standing together on the porch of High Hollow Ranch, their faces radiating the happiness and purpose that had emerged from the ashes of their separate sorrows. But even as she treasured the new portrait, Lavinia noticed that Clayton had kept the old one as well, placing it carefully in the memory box alongside his Medal of Honor and Sarah's letters. The past wasn't forgotten or replaced, it was honored and integrated into the foundation of what came next. 5 years later, New Hope had grown into a thriving community of over 200 residents. The Rusk Community Bank served customers throughout the territory with scrupulous fairness and innovative lending practices. The school had gained a reputation for excellence that drew students from neighboring states. And the agricultural cooperative that Ruth had established had become a model for sustainable farming practices. But perhaps the most satisfying vindication came in the form of the visitors who regularly arrived at New Hope. Other women who had heard about the community where they could own property, start businesses, and live independently if they chose. Like Lavinia and Ruth 6 years earlier, they came with little more than hope and determination, seeking a chance to start over. And just as Clayton had once done, the residents of New Hope opened their doors and their hearts to these new arrivals, proving that the spirit of generosity and possibility that had founded their community would continue to guide its growth. On a warm spring morning in 1893, Lavinia and Clayton stood on the same porch where they had first talked about love and the future, watching a wagon approach from the east. In it sat 2 young women, clearly sisters, with dust in their hair and fear in their eyes, but also something else, the unmistakable spark of determination that comes from refusing to accept that current circumstances define future possibilities. "Should we go meet them?" Clayton asked, already knowing the answer. "Of course," Lavinia replied, taking his hand as they walked toward the newest arrivals. "After all, we know something about second chances." The brass compass in its silver frame caught the morning light from its place of honor on the mantelpiece, its needle pointing steadily north toward the mountains, toward home, and toward the enduring truth that sometimes the most important journeys begin with a simple plea for shelter and the wisdom to recognize that helping others find their way home is the surest path to finding your own.